This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite horrors, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jesse Carter. This week, we're talking with Naben Ruthnum about his new book, The Grimmer. Naben Ruthnum is the author of A Hero of Our Time, Help Meet, and the thrillers Find You in the Dark and Your Life Is Mine, under his pen name, Nathan Ripley. He currently resides in Toronto. Welcome to the show, Naben.
Thanks for having me.
So, Naben, tell us a bit about yourself.
I'm a Canadian. I was raised in Kelowna in British Columbia. Been a big horror fan since, I'd say like age 7 or 8 on. Like in everything from like English ghost stories to slasher movies. Sort of the things that inspired the book that we're going to be talking about today. Like the books of John Bellairs and Ray Bradbury, I think is a big part of it. And a big part of how I envision Halloween too. So hopefully we can chat about him a bit.
I saw in your long-form bio that you have done some academic work about Oscar Wilde and ghost stories. A lot of people get lured into horror fiction by movies, just getting exposed to things by older siblings and schoolyard talk. What led you into the more stately ghost tradition?
I think that kind of arose first by accident and then by inclination created by accident. But I was a big, used bookstore and library book sale kid. That was the one thing that my parents were super indulgent in when we were kids, is within reason, basically, we could get any book, and maybe not as all the ones we wanted to, but at a library book sale, certainly. And when I was like 8 or 9, I got a book called The Sorceress in Stained Glass, which was the first anthology that Richard Dalby put together. And if you look that name up, he's like one of the legendary ghost story anthologists, one of these guys who would buy like a collection of magazines from 1888 and like go through all of them and find like a lost ghost story. So finding those and kind of like reading indiscriminately, like I'd read like an M.R. James story and then read a Stephen King novel. It just became kind of like all part of like the big fabric quilts of horror to me. And yeah, I just was always attracted to that, as you say, stately, hemmed in, quiet British ghost stuff, and the American equivalent in like Henry James and Edith Wharton, because it felt like there was something really psychological and weird under the surface that was never quite coming out. Of course, you can't really put that into words as a kid, but to me, that's always been a big part of what makes a ghostly and haunting story exist. It's not just the slurpy apparitions; it's also that weird sense that there's something in the human psyche that can't be expressed, that somehow has something to do with all these supernatural happenings.
Do you think that fostered your interest in literary fiction?
That's interesting. I feel like, I mean, I didn't come to literary fiction as a little child, of course, so I did come to it through genre, and I think, that does make sense. It's like it was that more the subtle ghost stuff that led into like the pleasures of literary fiction. I think that, to me, there's always like a big gray area and overlap. Like those two names that just dropped, Henry James and Edith Wharton, of course, are remembered primarily as literary writers, but they both wrote amazing ghost stories. But, guess what? It's the same sentences, the same prose, the same writer. So those are literary fiction too. And well-written horror is literature, of course. And not to slam pulp at all. Like, pulp is huge for me, and pulp can be well-written in its way. But that perfectly constructed Oxford English type of writing in some of those British ghost stories by M.R. James, etc., I think that did lead me into Victorian, Edwardian English lit that I was eventually to embrace.
But you didn't stop there, because you've also broken out into thriller writing and screenwriting.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm very lucky in that like my tastes are very indiscriminate, and the things that I like to write are a wide range, which unless you're like a genius as well as an anointed genius that everybody in the establishment recognizes, it's extremely difficult to make your living with literary fiction. Extremely, extremely difficult. This has always been the case, but it's particularly the case now, perhaps. And my writing really reflects my reading and also my watching. I would say especially noir and psychological thriller crime stuff from the 20th century. That was big for me. So those two thrillers I wrote were definitely in the mold of Thomas Harris's Red Dragon, which is like in the 80s. So I actually feel slightly out of step in the world of thrillers that are popular right now. Like, to me, they've become so streamlined. It's such like plot-oriented story delivery machines. I feel a bit like this is my favorite stuff to read, and also as much as I respect like the discipline and craft that goes into making one of those, it's not a machine that I can build. So Eventually, I felt like a little out of place there, but a lot of those same tools are so useful to a screenwriter. And I love the movies, especially. I like TV too, but I must admit my heart belongs to movies. So writing screenplays was natural for me too. I actually started that in high school. I always wanted to do both at once. And don't get the idea that I was a successful screenwriter then or even now. But I started writing screenplays when I was 15 or so.
And you were also in a band. So I feel like you've got your literary side, and then there's a side of you that just wants to make direct impact entertainment or art.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because there's a sense I had when I was a kid and as a teenager that, oh, eventually I'll outgrow X and I'll outgrow Y. Like, eventually, like, I won't Conan the Barbarian books by Robert E. Howard. There's probably going to be a day where I don't listen to death metal, but that was going to be something that shaped me. That day is still not arrived. Like, I'm 41 years old, and there's still something about, like the simple truth of like a really well played riff that is, it's an irreplaceable pleasure as a consumer of art, and there's a magic to it that I would really like to continue to look for and seek and produce in the art that I make now.
Nice. I think now's as good a time as any to jump into your latest project, The Grimmer.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, it's the story of Vish Moria, who about age 15, 16. He's sort of been like tossed out of his life for a couple of years because his father had addiction issues, and while his parents battened down the hatches and dealt with that, they sent Vish away to a boarding school for a couple of years. We meet Vish when he's coming back to his hometown and his family home, which is in Kelowna, BC, where incidentally I also grew up. It's in the year 1996, and Vish is settling into his life again and trying to feel like a part of his family and try to repress some of the anger he feels about sort of being put on the shelf. But he does know that he still loves heavy metal and books. He's in the used bookstore in town that he always missed. And there's a sort of a middle-aged South Asian gentleman who runs the place. Vish, as you might have guessed by his name, is also from a South Asian family in a super white town. So that first day that Vish is back in the bookstore, the sort of otherworldly creature in the most down-to-earth clothing imaginable enters. And Vish realizes that he's stepped into like a supernatural zone. There's a sort of demonic filing cabinet of a person, somebody who's been collecting souls and intends to put those souls in new bodies, who's appeared in his little small town, and he doesn't really understand why. Agastya, the man who owns that bookstore, and Shizela, who's a young woman, they're going to explain to Vish the ropes of this new semi-magic universe, which he may not never quite understand, but he knows he has a role in.
It occurs to me that the standard move would be to send Vish away to this boarding school where he is completely alienated and everything is new, and he's the Harry Potter type audience access character who gets all of the rules of this new unusual place explained to him, and he would have to prove himself, etc., etc. You instead opted for something much more subtle, which is he's coming home and things are slightly different. And he has all these resentments built up underneath the surface, and he has to figure out how to reconnect. And I'd almost say that's one of the themes of the story is reconnection instead of coming of age necessarily.
Yeah, it's. I mean, you've exactly hit upon it. He's coming back in what's supposed to be familiar, and instead finding that it's completely unfamiliar. Both because the town and his family and his friends have changed, but also because he's changed. He's grown up a couple of years, even though he feels pretty stunted in a lot of ways, and he's supposed to pretend like it's life as usual. So yeah, the sense of like trying to reconnect to what he was and what his family was and what his friends were, I think is almost replaced by the kind of coming of age and growing up notion that you cannot reconnect with your past. You can only find ways to connect with your present while looking back towards your past. And that's what this sort of magic incursion and these encounters with evil sort of make him face, is that there are people around him now that he can learn to trust or not, and there is always himself, and he can learn whether to rely on himself or not. Those are the choices he has, not resentment of what he didn't get or what might not have happened, but what he can do right now.
That kind of uncertainty, those dark emotions lingering under the surface, do you think that the antagonist, Ferris, is a reflection of that? Because he has a paper-thin face over this teeming multitude of voices and desires.
Yeah, that's really canny of you. I'll part the curtain a bit here and say like almost anything clever in any of my books happens subconsciously, and then I notice it on second draft. But I think that's very much the case with Ferris. Part of what the Grimmer is about is that cusp moment in childhood going into adulthood where you're kind of deciding what you're going to be. Like you can make these decisions even between junior high and high school. And I can remember myself really consciously passing between schools and being like, I don't want to be like this or like this or like this anymore. I want to be like this. And Ferris literally contains multitudes. There are thousands of beings within the single being, and the mask never quite sticks. And there's something monstrous about his attempts to disguise himself. And I think, yeah, that you could really read that as being sort of a monstrous incarnation of the many different ways to be an adult, an adult man in Vish's case, and him not quite knowing which face to put on which day.
There is one school of thought whenever you get into fantasy or anything supernatural, which is even if you don't show your math and explain all the rules, there needs to be a quote unquote system so that things don't feel too slippery or too deus machina. Someone can just pull out a spell at any point and just fix any problem. The other school is that you don't want to over explain things or you're going to literally demystify it and it won't be magical at all. How did you walk that line?
My guiding principle was definitely a story principle in that I wanted the magic to feel like part of this world and never sort of like a magic key to get us to the next part of the story safely. And I think that's why people get so interested / obsessed by systems and just knowing that there are rules here and we can follow those rules. I also really, though, wanted to be aligned with Vish, who not only is young in this book, but isn't intellectually up to understanding the extremely complex magic that Gisela, the magician character, really understands well because she's had, in some ways, like not to get into the whole time travel mechanics of the book, she's had a lot of time, like hundreds of years of study to really learn these things. And I thought it would be neat to sort of put the reader in Vish's position and also truthful to say that I can show you some of this magic and I can show you the results of it and I can explain its limits. But for God's sakes, I can't actually explain to you how this works because it took me years and years and years to not just use it, but just to understand it. So I feel like some readers probably think that that's a have your cake and eat it thing as well, like that the author doesn't need to know all the magical rules. And you know what? They're right. But my role is to make sure the story never feels out of control and that you never have that moment where you want to toss the book away because magic keeps on getting used as a parachute to get you to the next chapter.
That's really well said. The magic is very restrained. No one ever gets to stand by comfortably and let magic solve the problem. There's always a sacrifice with everything that happens, or there is a terrifying act of committing to engaging with the magic that doesn't feel safe at all. It always feels like the character, at least Vish, is not in control when he has to engage with the magic. But he could always turn tail and run and leave the situation, which is interesting. You always give him an out. Repeatedly, people are like, this is up to you. We'll explain it. We'll show you. We'll give you this fix, but you're the one that actually has to carry it out. It makes the magic incumbent upon his choices.
Yeah, I wanted to give Vish something. I feel like in so much writing for young people, particularly when it's about when magic or sci-fi gets involved, there's a compulsion on the part of the author, the audience, to have this kid get the powers, eventually seize his destiny, eventually be the most powerful person in the room, as you'd seen, for example, in a Harry Potter. And I was adamant that I was not going to allow Vish that. And that was really something that I got from the John Bellairs books about with characters like Johnny Dixon, Anthony Munday, Louis Barneveld. They always remained sort of normal kids, but the thing that they had to do constantly is not surrender their curiosity and learn courage and steadfastness. Sometimes the bravest and the most progressive and the most expansive thing you can do in your life that makes you a bigger person is standing in the same place and refusing to leave. And I think I give Vish a lot of those moments, as you say, where like there's a door that opens and he can step away. He can ignore what he's learned and he can ignore what potential consequences might occur if he does turn away, and he decides to stay. He decides to stick with it. So that's as close as he gets to a hero's journey. And I think it is satisfying.
Nice. So on a similar track, you have a monster in your story, several monsters, in fact. How do you name the monster and explain somewhat where they come from or how they work without losing the horror element or that feeling of otherworldliness?
For one thing, I always leave the option open that Vish is being lied to, and I don't think it's necessarily something that every reader is going to pick up on. But when the monsters are explained to Vish, they're being explained by the same people who are like, you won't understand this magic anyway. So there's always a chance that, as your parents might when you're young, you're getting the sort of Cliff Notes version of what the actual thing is. I think the monsters are so weird that they are unknowable in some way. I also like, for one, the creature Zerg. Ferris presents a different vision of what that monster might be. So there's like two contradicting ideas of what this thing that you encounter is. And it's actually on screen or on the page rather, for such a brief time that I feel like it's something that readers would go back to and think about and puzzle over, as opposed to really need an explanation of.
Ferris is a Noxer? How do you pronounce that?
I think it's Noxera. Yeah.
You name check the German Noxerer for Ferris, but you've totally remixed the concept. Zerg, which is something much more hyperdimensional and strange, seems like your own invention. Ferris also seems like your own invention, but you tethered him to this folkloric idea of a revenant.
I really wanted to do something that along the lines of what Mike Mignola does in Hellboy, where he really does work with these time-tested folkloric legends and then puts them in an American superhero concept. I began with that, but then I realized, like, I really do want to expand what this creature could be and what it could do. And there's so many different definitions of like revenant and vampiric action, like what they do and what consuming blood does or what consuming souls might be. And I basically decided to sort of use that flexibility and to say that, Gisela, being from Germany, is going to use this term for this creature, but that term might not actually apply to everything that Ferris does. So that's definitely a bit cake and eat it. It's a riff on vampirism and revenant stuff that I feel is in keeping with like people like Dan Simmons, who's Carrying Comfort is like a crazy vampire mind control novel that he's using terms that are familiar to us and then expanding them in a way that's acceptable to us. So that's what I wanted to do.
Some of your other books seem more focused on adult topics like murder and office politics and things like that.
Sure. Yeah.
What made you want to write a YA book?
As with all of my books, it was really unplanned. Like, it definitely wasn't like a genre first idea. It was a story first idea. And I think in this case, it did come from just rereading a lot of the stuff that I read when I was, the age where I first encountered it, as we talked about earlier in the interview. Like, for example, I got a very expensive old edition of The Sorceress in Stained Glass, that anthology, because I'd lost the dust jacket of mine. And I reread all those stories, and then I reread a ton of John Bellairs and a bunch of books by Robert Westall, who's a British ghost story writer, and just found myself like really marinating in these horror stories for young readers from my youth. Like, even though they weren't necessarily all written in my youth. I just written my first horror novella, Helpmeet, and I don't know, horror was sort of on the brain for me. And I kind of wanted to write something that I had never done before, which was a warm novel of characters, where there wasn't much bite or satire or meanness between the characters. It was about basically good people encountering change and encountering evil from the outside. And I realized, like, all these books I've been reading and all these reflections I've been having about being a young reader of horror, I think really fit with this story, and that story fit in the young adult world.
So, as you mentioned in your summary, Vish's father had a struggle with addiction for several years, and that is a major pillar of the story. Even though his father's in recovery, so much of the plot was driven by that one aspect of his life. Was there any pushback from the editor bringing in something like pill addiction to a YA story?
You know what? Not at all. I feel like that. You know what? You never know what the people who said no to the book didn't like about it, though, right? Like any editor who passes on a story will usually say a couple generous things and something about how the fit isn't quite right. So maybe that was a turnoff. But I feel like, I mean, as I kind of researched around when I was writing the second draft, read some more contemporary YA, I realized, like, I'm pretty soft shoe when it comes to these like big major social issues and psychological issues, and even quite nonviolent compared to like what a lot of contemporary YA is. So I don't think that was a big barrier. Personally, when I was writing it, it was something that I hesitated about because it's not part of my own background. Like, I don't have a parent who struggled with addiction, and it's serious business and it's a serious experience. And I really wanted to do justice to it, basically. Like, I didn't want to just completely go in without any sort of research and just make it a dark element, quote unquote, in the character's background. I wanted to do justice by it, but it just seemed like so perfect in a story about a character's past and a character's future and the ability to trust addiction and like the sort of genetic component to addiction and the breach of trust between a father and son. It just felt like a really important part of the story I was trying to tell.
It's interesting that you said you set out to write a warm novel with characters building trust. I think you didn't just throw it in there as the darkness du jour. You didn't just pull it off a shelf and plug it in, like a dead mother or something like that.
Mm.
Vish's parents are alive. They are together. You do show the pain and the progress of the aftermath of addiction. There is a therapist involved. There are people who came together that rallied around Vish's father. So I really do think that was a success.
Thank you. Yeah. If you think about what Vish's mother had to do to keep the household together, and if you think about how much his father, who also works in mental health, the sort of professional network around him, like both people are on his side and people who might have disliked him and wanted to see him lose his reputation and job. There's like a whole grown-up novel sort of hovering in the background, which I think hopefully lends some gravitas to the story here, and like the things that Vish doesn't quite understand and aren't part of his personal experience, but that are definitely part of his family's struggle.
My last question about the Grimmer: how much do you and your protagonist have in common?
In terms of our tastes, they're absolutely aligned for that time and place in Kelowna. In terms of what we're like as people, honestly, not that much. And I think that was like quite important. Like, I struggled like with what age I wanted to make him, because to some degree, because we liked so much of the same stuff, I thought he was going to be a bit more like me. But at 15 or 16, like I was a much, I think, meaner and more sarcastic person, and not in like a cool, interesting way, in like an insecure, always trying to get one up and like trying to impose my personality on my very patient friends and family at the time. Not necessarily a character I think is that appealing or that I'd want to write about. So I thought, oh, maybe I should make him younger. And then I realized, like, no, maybe I should just make him quite a bit different from the way I was as a young man. And yeah, and I think that's what you see on the page. But in terms of like his passions for differing things, as we were talking about earlier in this conversation, just that sort of love for the high and low in art, he definitely has that. And yeah, so that's a way in which I could really connect with my character.
Also, you gave yourself that 2-year pause when he was away in school, so that he was sort of arrested in his development. And he feels like that when he's trying to figure out how to interact with Gisela and things like that. He feels like a younger character instead of a snarky, annoying, real-world 15-year-old boy.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. I'm glad that explanation worked too. Although I can't explain why I also was incredibly awkward and unable to interact with people at ages 15 or 16, because I did not go to boarding school. I was just a jerk.
That's just being 15, man. It's
Yes.
it's rough stuff. So what projects are you working on next?
I have enough little deadlines in screenwriting world that I managed to start a novel in order to avoid all of my work. So I'm writing another sort of, I guess you'd call it a literary novel, but um, I'm not. It's in that very like soupy stage of like, we'll see if I get to page 50 of this, and then I'll decide whether I'm gonna outline it out and think it out a little more and get it to the end. Which is how most of my books, by the way, are made. They're just like I just write freely for a good chunk, 50 or 100 pages, and then I start to do some planning and serious structural work. And yeah, I just wrote a pilot for a sort of horror inflected show that is also about kids in some way, but it's geared towards grown-ups.
Cool. Where can our listeners find you online? Or can they find you online?
You know what? I think the best place to actually access me is on great podcasts like this. I really appreciate like the caliber of conversation here. Like you treated this book like it was a real book, and I think that the conversation really benefits the results. Yeah, that was really perceptive, and I appreciate it a lot.
My pleasure. Thanks for being on the show. Please subscribe and follow. Links are in the show notes. You can find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular.